We are going to look at two short sections in Mark today, the end of chapter 2 and the beginning of chapter 3. Starting in Mark chapter 2, verse 23, and going through Mark chapter 3, verse 6. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need of food? He entered the house of God, where Abiathar was high priest, and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priests to eat. And he gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, the Sabbath was made for human beings, and not human beings for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." Again, he entered the synagogue, and a man was there who had a withered hand. They watched him to see whether he would cure him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. And he said to the man who had the withered hand, "Come forward." And then he said to them, "Is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save a life or to kill?" But they were silent. He looked around at them with anger. He was grieved at the hardness of heart, and he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out and immediately conspired with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. There's this thing in Jewish law, and we come across it, I think I've mentioned it before, when the man approaches Jesus and says, "Which is the greatest commandment of the law? How do you read it?" And Jesus replied back with, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself." What they're talking about there in that situation, and what Jesus is referencing right here, is this hierarchy of how you obey the law. What do you do when two commandments come up against each other? What do you do when the law says to do this, but it also says to do this? And in this situation, you have to decide which law you're going to keep and which law you're going to break. That's a big deal, right? Which law are you going to keep and which law are you going to break? There's not a whole lot of times when you and I have that kind of a situation legally, right? Thankfully, laws for you and me don't necessarily intersect like that. But there are times when we have to decide whether to keep the law of God or whether to keep the law of man. And so we can identify in some ways. When I think about situations that arise with choosing the law of God over the law of man, it might be a little different than what you're thinking about. I think about those people who have been arrested for feeding homeless people in the park. Those people who have gotten huge fines for putting a quarter in somebody's parking meter as the parking attendant was writing a ticket, and they put a quarter in and they got busted for being kind. In small ways and in big ways, sometimes we have to make those choices. Jesus, on this day, right, two instances, and Mark puts them back to back, and I think he does it for a reason. He has them walking through the grain field and receiving criticism for as they walk and they're hungry, taking the heads of grain and just rubbing the grain out of the head so that they could eat the raw kernels. Anybody chewed on a raw wheat kernel? That's not really a gourmet feast, right? That's not really what you're looking for to satisfy your deep hunger, and to get it out of the husk in the first place isn't a pleasant process by hand. They came under criticism because what they were doing was technically harvesting and threshing grain, which is work. It's work. But Jesus said they're hungry. They're hungry, for goodness sakes. When he's in the synagogue and he sees the man with the withered hand and he says, "Come forward." And he asks these religious teachers, which is more important on the Sabbath? How do we honor God on the Sabbath? Do we honor it by continuing to allow this person to suffer? Or do we honor God by offering healing and restoration? Which is better, to save a life or to end a life? In Jewish law, rabbinical law, the prosperity of human life, the continuation of human life, the flourishing of human life, is the current law that they use to read every other law. They've got two laws. They say which one is going to flourish human existence, which one is going to be a detriment. And they've got, oh my goodness, book upon book upon book discussing the merits of how that applies in different situations. But Jesus is holding up the very standard that current rabbinic teaching upholds, which is that human life is the highest good. Human life is the highest good. He says to the Pharisees at the end of that first section something important. He says the Sabbath was made for human beings, not human beings for the Sabbath. The Sabbath was created as a blessing for the people of Israel coming out of slavery. It was a day when they had worth and value apart from their physical labor, apart from their economic value. God was saying to them, I created you and you bear my image. You have worth and value above and beyond your ability to be productive. So I want you to take a day off and just be. I want you to take a day off and just be. And in that beingness, you are glorifying me. Just in existing, you bring me honor and glory. You don't have to work. So it was not originally meant to be a set of chains that would keep hungry people from eating or to keep a lame man from being healed. It was meant to offer freedom. It was meant to offer liberty. Sometimes I think that we get bogged down in our rules of the way things should be. We have our ideas and our expectations, whether they're written rules or unwritten rules. We've decided in our hearts and heads how it should be. And just like we spoke last week about how Jesus came to do something new, and to do something new needed a new container. Sometimes, in order to experience the freedom and the liberty that God intended for us to experience, we have to let go of our expectations. We have to let go of the containers that we want to use to hold God's blessings in. My child,